Hello and welcome to another fabulous episode of Altitude. And by fabulous, I mean today for you, we have a fabulous guest, Scott Raynovich, who is the founder and chief analyst of Futuriom, one of the leading emerging cloud technology analyst firms. So Scott, thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks, Woody. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So today, I'd like to focus a lot on unpacking the information in the latest Futuriom report and talking about trends and outcomes as we move into 2023 for cloud. But before that, I'd like to focus a little bit on your background. As I was doing homework for the show, I couldn't help but notice you come from a really cool kind of eclectic interdisciplinary background, just like myself. We have some commonalities. We're both musicians. We both love rock and roll. And I thought I had to ask your opinion on the strength of people that come from, IDS and varied backgrounds in technology.
Thanks. Yeah, interesting question, Woody. And we were talking about this earlier. The way I look at it is technology and music and language aren't really that different. They're all different types of languages. In fact, you could argue that music is a type of code, right? So I think things like music are really important, and I've met a lot of people in technology who are musicians, and I think music is instrumental in training your brain in different ways and training you how to think in different ways, and it kind of generates creativity, which is often needed to solve many technology problems. So I see all these things as interrelated.
Yeah, I agree. In my history working in the tech field, I've met a lot of musicians and artists and other people that come from interdisciplinary backgrounds. In fact, one of my earlier jobs was working the phones and support queue at F5 Networks when I was first getting into this thing. And the guy that sat right next to me was the former bass player for Nico Case. So that was really cool. Scott was his name, really nice guy and brilliant, network engineer. So it is really cool how there's that overlap between music and arts and technology for all the reasons that you described. I also want to talk about the success of Futuriom because that really stuck out to me as I was doing research into your company in preparation for today's show. Focusing on the Futuriom 40, which for our listeners is now the Futuriom 50, there's been a high degree of success between the companies that the Futuriom 40 has earmarked as, up-and-coming companies to watch and pay attention to, and those companies that have recently made big exits as of last year. So, for example, Cohesity, Couchbase, Darktrace, HashiCorp, these are all names that we should be familiar with if we're tracking the progress of startups and their exits in the technology sector. And in fact, since the Futuriom 40 was around since of 2021, the companies that are being tracked on that list have raised over $13.3 billion in funding, which is very impressive. So, Scott, whatever you're doing at Futuriom, you're doing right. Can you talk a little bit about the secret of your success?
Sure. Thanks, Woody. Thanks for the compliments. We're always trying to do better, however. We are really, when I think about analysis and research, I mean, the base material is data, and we're a very data-driven enterprise. And the way I think about it is before we formulate an opinion or make a list or write about companies, we try to gather as much data as possible. That includes like data you can find on the fundraising and the past record of the founders, but also includes talking to people. And I like to say, I was a journalist before I was an analyst, and I was an editor-in-chief for many years, and I used to tell reporters, your information is only good as who you're talking to, so try to find the smartest people in the industry and talk to them because they know more than you. And that's how I manage myself. I try to talk to people that are smarter than myself in the industry and gather as many of their ideas as possible. So all that gets baked into the Futuriom 50, and anything we do, we try to gather as much data as possible and talk to people that are smarter than us to tell us, what's happening.
All right, so let's dive into the report itself for a little bit, the one that came out just recently that's, predicting emerging trends for cloud in 2023, which, of course, we're just off to a roaring interesting start here. The broad themes that were discussed in the report in terms of hot technologies and associated companies to keep an eye on circulated around topics such as unified cloud security, distributed cloud infrastructure, cloud data management, And in those three pillars, some other technologies and areas to explore further and to look at companies that were involved were zero trust networking, edge compute, secure cloud networks and secure cloud networking, and of course SASE, which we know as secure access service edge. There were others as well, of course, but I want to focus on those because today I just want to focus on the infrastructure side, the networking and security side, because I'm interested in the impact that the current economy might have in those sectors. I mean, obviously, it's been a rough ride for technology companies over the last 2 or 3 months. We're seeing a lot of layoffs across all facets of the cloud and IT industry. If you're reading the headlines, it's apparent that the tech industry is certainly shedding some jobs, likely not only in response to current economic headwinds, but of course to the great amount of hiring that they did to kind of close gaps in 2020 when coronavirus hit and all of a sudden work from home and remote productivity really exploded, and there was this mad rush, to fill the gap and get talent on board. So how do you think that's going to impact some of the predictions you made in the report, and more specifically the infrastructure space in cloud, which isn't always where companies focus or spend?
Great question, Woody. Well, we're certainly in some sort of economic slowdown. We don't really know what that looks like in terms of the how big it is, though I will say, as somebody who's lived through a couple bubble implosions, the 2000, 2001 internet bubble deflation, and then the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, this one doesn't look nearly as bad. And the way to think about it was that we're really coming out of a massive response to the pandemic where there was a lot of stimulus and an acceleration towards hybrid work environments and digital strategies, and companies had to adopt those technologies very quickly to respond to this kind of unprecedented change in the environment. So really, there was this huge surge to digital and cloud technologies, and now we're just pulling back a little bit. But companies are going to still look to expand their cloud infrastructure, but they're going to be more focused on things like optimization, like how can we optimize these cloud environments and maybe make them more efficient and not spend as much, not waste as much. And that's kind of what some of the trends that Aviatrix are involved with, such as hybrid and multi-cloud, are all about. It's about optimizing the cloud infrastructure that you have.
All right. So yeah, that is good news for a lot of the startups and other companies you mentioned on the list, because there is definitely a theme of consolidation and optimization happening right now in the infrastructure space. So point of that example, one of the areas you mentioned to pay attention to is this merging of edge and core networking and cloud, meaning that they tend to be coming together and consolidating in single platforms or interlaced platforms, as opposed to having edge as a corporate thing into cloud, and then cloud network as its own thing that data centers connect into. So edge and cloud networks are kind of growing together and becoming cohesive. What factors do you see driving this in the industry? Do you think that it's all about efficiency? Is it about cost? Is it just that this is really the best way to go about building an edge strategy now, one that's more intelligent into what's happening in cloud? I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yes, as we move into these, let's call them hybrid environments, it's exactly what you said. It's like stitching together the enterprise edge with the public cloud infrastructure and the resources wherever you might have them. It's really about visibility and management. And I was just actually writing an article about this. In the first phase of cloud, you had these huge public cloud companies like Amazon building this resource on the cloud, but the adoption was somewhat messy and chaotic. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard of shadow IT, where business units would just click on a cloud and adopt it, but the folks managing the IT environment or the security environment or the CEO really didn't have a handle on how this infrastructure was being used. So I think as we move into this next phase, whatever you want to call it, hybrid, multi-cloud environments, it's really about getting a handle on all the cloud resources that are being used and maybe managing that a little better with visibility and having some insight, because I'm not saying it's bad if a business unit adopts a cloud and starts using it, but maybe they should be talking to everybody else in the organization so they know they're not double adopting a cloud or something like this. And I think this is going to be part of the cloud optimization process.
Right. So if we think about one of the key benefits of cloud, and of course there are several, and there's key challenges in cloud as well, we know that. But one of the key benefits of cloud, of course, is orchestration, automation, right? Infrastructure as code. And, cloud has reached a fairly decent maturity level with that on the infrastructure side. It's not perfect, of course, and there's, a lot of companies out there that are addressing these gaps and moving in to make things better for customers. But by and large, if you're good with Terraform or Ansible or Bicep or something, you could build cloud networks in days or even hours, as opposed to the months or even longer it would take to really roll out big networks in the on-prem space. And looking at Edge, you're saying that maybe what Edge needs to do is benefit from that same agility, right? To be able to deploy Edge almost as seamlessly and automatically as one could deploy a cloud network. Is that part of that motion?
Absolutely. And Edge is kind of it can be an abused term, but not just Edge, but traditional infrastructure, meaning like the installed base, right? Like there's billions and billions of dollars of installed compute, network, and storage in the enterprise environment, and they don't want to just throw that away, right? They want to use that and leverage that with the cloud.
Okay, makes sense. I'd like to talk for a little bit about this phenomenon that I've been tracking personally myself over the last couple of years that I see accelerating, which is a phenomenon I call the incredible shrinking internet. And I think it's important for today's conversation while we're talking about Edge getting folded into cloud native networking. So if you look at what's happening in terms of the growth of cloud networks out, right? The cloud private networks are getting bigger. Their edge sites are getting more intelligent and profound and pushing into spaces such as meet-me's and colos and pops and so forth. That is working also in concert with customers moving legacy infrastructure or, heritage infrastructure, as I call it, into the meet-me or into the pop so that it's physically closer to cloud. So some of these workloads of consequence that are harder to migrate and virtualize or refactor end up in, a Cologix or Equinix facility, for example, running there so they can be close. And what then connects these stacks sometimes is private connectivity technologies like Direct Connect or ExpressRoute as opposed to the internet. But then also we have a proliferation of IoT devices and smart devices that are jumping on cloud networks through specialized operating systems like Azure Sphere and so forth, and they're riding 5G. And of course, there's been a lot of stuff in the news about partnerships between big cloud service providers and wireless carriers to make their services more seamless and cohesive. So the clouds are pressing out. Workloads of consequence are pressing in. IoT devices are able to get in over 5G and access PaaS and SaaS services pretty quickly over private networks. And then finally, we have the fact that a lot of the internet destinations, those business websites you love, those websites of interest that you love, social networking, etc., are all now hosted in cloud or themselves really a proper cloud like Facebook or Meta or something. So I'm curious as to what that leaves on the internet from some of these more traditional edge technologies. So just, to pick on one, segment like SD-WAN, for example. Not that SD-WAN is, going to drive and blow away, but I'm curious as to how this phenomenon might change the optics of what's happening in the SD-WAN market today.
I want to push back a little bit on the idea of that the internet is shrinking, or because I actually don't think that's the case. I think it might be morphing because when you talk about the technologies we're using right now, these are basically internet IP-based technologies, right? And when you talk about something like remote work, hybrid work, what's actually happening is people are using the internet more. They're using broadband connectivity to connect. Now, you have to secure that connectivity, and you might run some type of overlay, but is that the internet or not? Well, I would argue they're using the core internet technologies, and then they're building, more value on top of that to make them more accessible. But SD-WAN initially, to go back to SD-WAN, initially was about replacing a legacy technology known as MPLS, multi-protocol label switching, and using more internet technologies to do that. And I think that evolution is still happening. But to your point, because there's so many different resources now to use in the cloud, there's just more options. But I think all this is good news for hybrid workers and enterprises and organizations, because the economy of scale of the cloud, as you mentioned, folks like Equinix and Cloudflare and Microsoft and Google, as they build out this cloud infrastructure that enables you to get to the internet faster, or get to an internet-like service faster and more securely, the impact is that it drives down the cost for everybody. There's no doubt that connecting to things is cheaper than it's ever been before. So I think that's all good news for us that are trying to do podcasts on the internet and things like this.
All right, Scott. So I want to talk a little bit about two terms that were kind of new to me that came up on the Futuriom 40 report. Now, of course, the Futuriom 50. And that was networking as a service, or NAS, and multi-cloud networking, or MCN. So just maybe help myself and the listeners understand those terms. Are kind of new in the industry. You did peg them as terms that would be more important in 2023 and beyond. Are they the same thing? Networking as a service and multi-cloud networking? Just unpack those terms for us and tell us how you think they're going to unfold.
Sure. They can be the same thing, but as we know in the technology industry, jargon can be much abused, and there can also be differences in how people treat jargon. But going back to what you talked about, this kind of private internet, let's call it, the private internet that could exist in Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud or Amazon, any cloud, basically. They've built this massive networking infrastructure that's really at our disposal to use, right? So the question is, how can you leverage that by, building some sort of hybrid or multi-cloud network that connects the many different resources that are out there? That is kind of what we define as multi-cloud networking, connecting multiple cloud networks together. So you're using the Microsoft Azure, or you're using the Amazon network, or you're using Equinix POPs. Multi-cloud networking technology would be kind of an abstraction layer of networks to glue all these things together and have better visibility and management to use these things as one logical network. So that's kind of how I view multi-cloud. Network as a service, I think, takes that concept to a different approach, which means you're just kind of going on the cloud and using a network, but kind of like a software as a service. You're using a database in the cloud, but there's many different approaches to either, and I think they cross over in certain ways. Companies in the space are doing things many different ways. So really it comes down to the consumer of the technology and how they want to use these networks in the cloud and how much control they want over it. Is it a small, medium business where you might just want to click in and just use some network, or is it a Fortune 500 company where it's more sophisticated and you need to connect all your branch offices and have monitoring and visibility of how these cloud networks are being used?
It's interesting to me how different businesses and enterprises want to use these big cloud backbones. Some of them, it's really just about getting traffic from one cloud workload to another, or one region to another, and basically just an intra-cloud motion. And of course, there's a lot of throughput there. Some of these cloud workloads are getting really big and moving a lot of traffic, so it's not like small pipes or anything. But then there are other enterprises that are starting to look at the ability to, like you said, edge is, if it's converging into a software managed network space that runs in the clouds, looking at connecting a bunch of different branch sites or colleges or edge sites, whatever. There's all kinds of different edge sites, as we know. And then using the cloud backbone as a way for one edge to talk to another. Some CSPs are hedging their bet that this is going to be a big growth vector in the future. So, for example, with Azure, we have their virtual WAN product, which is meant to evangelize this pattern, connect your edge to us, use the Microsoft network, and then you don't have to use a carrier network like your typical AT&T and Verizon. Is this coming up in your conversations with the folks you talk to? This idea that maybe we're going to see the pendulum swing to where the cloud networks are going to start to connect in a lot of edge locations as the predominant path, or not?
Oh, 100%. I mean, and it's not speculation. I go back to the data I told you we collect, and we take we look at all the capital spending data, and which includes building out of POPs and building cloud infrastructure, and building of 5G networks. And what you see is over time, the cloud providers have become more powerful in kind of their investment and deployment of infrastructure, and they continue to do that, and they continue to deploy more POPs and connect closer to the end users in the major cities. So I think over time that's a clear trend that can be measured with infrastructure deployment.
Oh, that's cool. It's good to hear from you that same data set that it's not just in my imagination, that there's actual hard data to confirm that this motion is happening. Because I talk to a lot of customers, of course, but unlike you, I don't really look at the hard facts all the time. So a lot of my thoughts are anecdotal. So it's good to kind of to air that out. I want to end with one final question. We have time for one more talking point, and that is on this new buzzword, which has come out of the woodwork maybe over the last a year or so, which is zero trust networking, zero trust network architecture. Definitely something that was highlighted in your recent report. And the various ways that enterprises are designing and building these systems with cloud in mind. Edge, of course, and SASE plays a huge role here, but I just read an article recently that AWS kind of has a new service, and I'm sorry that I don't remember the name of the service itself. I'm sure I could Google it, but it's essentially like a super proxy, meaning that it's built into the AWS Cloud Edge, and it uses just like a thin client, essentially, from a workstation, you use, like a TLS connection, SSH, not SSH, but like a browser connection to come in, and then you perform like a super proxy user authentication just into their Uber service. Do you think this is the way of the future, where we're going to see the CSPs themselves get more involved in zero trust networking from the user side? Because zero trust networking means a lot of things, of course, but one of it is least privileged access for users, and one of it is very tight control of user identity versus the resources they get. I'm just wondering if, you see the CSPs encroaching into this space with their own kind of PaaS platforms, or if it's going to be more of the marketplace that leads.
I think it will be both. I mean, you can't have too much security, right, in this world. So the cloud providers, they need to provide the most security, to their end users. They want to make sure that, Woody, when you're connecting into Amazon, you are who you say you are, and as you said, there's several ways they can authenticate you. But zero trust is really about multiple forms of authentication and using identity, and so not just trusting an IP address, but gathering as much data about the user as possible to ensure they are who they say they are. So it's in Amazon's best interest to do that for their customers. But think of all the other things you're using. You might be connecting to, like you said, a 5G network that connects to Amazon. You might be connecting to an internet service that connects to Amazon, and they're going to want to authenticate you. And then you're connecting from your office. So how do you know that your connection to your office is secure, and how do they know it's secure? So there's multiple levels of security, and we really, when you talk about zero trust, it's going to be zero trust everywhere, not just at the Amazon pop.
Yeah. Okay. Good point. Well, any other topics or themes, Scott, that I missed that you want to hit on for our listeners? I mean, we've talked a lot about infrastructure and security and edge and all these things. Are there any other themes you want to bring to the table, for 2023 that might be relevant?
Well, Woody, one of the things I never got from you is like, what are some of your favorite bands and your music? Because you talked about being a musician.
Yeah, well, I was born in the 70s. I will disclose my age here on the show for the listeners, but I'm sure you could Google me and sort it out. But so I started with a lot of the 80s pop, but quickly graduated into punk rock in high school. It was a great time to be into the punk rock space because, a lot of the formative bands were still out there live touring, like the Germs and X and the Ramones and Circle Jerks. And so that was a really cool time. But interestingly, alongside of my interest in punk rock also was an interest in classical music. Because I was being trained to perform saxophone at Appalachian State University, which is a school in North Carolina that I attended that had a music program. So I was kind of living in two worlds. One was the focus on classical and repertoire, and one was the focus on, punk rock and kind of the rise of the alternative scene. And I found it was cool that there was like really intense things happening in both sides of the fence. And you see that with musicians sometimes, they're super eclectic. Their album collections like span hundreds of different bands and genres. So, and as I've grown older, I've gotten into all kinds of different music, from electric dance music to, of course, jazz as a saxophone player, and drummer. I was way into jazz for a while to even actually some commercial country, which really startled me. I didn't expect at all to get into commercial country, but the more I listened to it, the more I was like, wow, there's a lot of production value here. The musicianship's really good.
That's very cool. Yeah, I believe music should be a mashup as well of influences. And you mentioned the punk movement, but you didn't mention the Minutemen, which are one of my favorite bands of all time.
Oh, the Minutemen. Yeah, of course. Yeah, the Minutemen are great. They were from, I think, LA, right? And then they had, who is it? Was it Mike Watt that was their incredible bass player? And he went on with the drummer to be in Firehose, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct.
An interesting story about Firehose is that like one of the fans about the Minutemen was distraught that they broke up and kept writing him and asking him to do a new project. And they said, okay, come on. And he was the guitar player and singer for Firehose. So
yeah,
he just badgered them back into playing. Yeah, they're great. Mike Watt is an amazing bass player. I do love the Minutemen.
Very cool. Well, I look forward to jamming with you sometime.
Yeah, that'd be fun. I'd love to get together and play. I have an electric kit now. Do you have access to a drum set where you are in a practice space or something?
Well, I'm a guitarist, so you wouldn't want to see me play the drums. It would be ugly.
Okay. Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll be able to meet in person sometime and hang out and talk more about music. I would love that.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Woody.
You bet. Thank you.